So we have been working in combination with Decision Point Health and the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry on developing a new model for chronic disasters. The people that we have gathered here with us today are have all been very much a huge part of creating that and helping us kind of driving it forward and helping us develop what this model is going to look like. So I'm just going to introduce our panelists real quick and then they can take over. So first up, we have Grant Brenner, who is CEO and founding partner of Neighborhood Psychiatry and Wellness. He is board certified and a fellow of both the American Psychiatric Association and New York Academy of Medicine, and on faculty at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Hospital, former director of trauma service at the William Allenson White Institute, and co-chair of Vibrant Emotional Health's Crisis and Emotional Care Team Advisory Board, as well as co-chair of the Disasters, Trauma, and Global Health Committee for the Group for Advancement of Psychiatry. Next up, we have Sandra Koyfman, Behavioral Health Medical Director at Centene Advanced Behavioral Health. He's a psychiatrist with dual board certification in general adult psychiatry and addiction medicine, the chief medical officer of Athena Psych, clinical programs behavioral health medical director at Centene, and also a board member of our crisis emotional care team. And is also part of co-chair for the Disaster Mental Health Committee and he just does some really great work with Vibrant and the CECT.
Thank you. Small correction.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Formerly of Centene.
Formerly, I apologize. We have April Naturale, who is a member of Vibrant. She's our Assistant Vice President of National Programs and also on with the Crisis Emotional Care Team. She is a traumatic stress specialist with 30 years of experience as a health and mental health care administrator and a clinician specializing in responses to traumatic events. Then we also have last here is Kurt West. He's an associate professor of psychiatry and scientist at the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress, Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. And then not with us today, but who has also been very influential in creating this disaster model is Kathleen Clegg, who's an associate professor of psychiatry and been involved in clinical service, education, and administration in psychiatry throughout her career. Thank you, Kathleen, even though she sadly cannot join us today. So I'm going to share my screen. We have a little PowerPoint to start off with, and then we'll switch to the infographic for the new disaster model, just to make sure everybody can see it. Yes? Great. Okay. So take it away.
Okay, that's me, right?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And yes, Sandra is co-chair with me of the advisory board of Crisis and Emotional Care Team. And Kathy Clegg and I are co-chairs of the Group for the Advancement of Psychiatry, Disaster, Trauma, and Global Health Committee, where a few years ago, as we were thinking about our experience as disaster mental health responders in the context of the pandemic, of the political tumult, of climate change, we were thinking about whether our current ways of conceptualizing disaster response could somehow encapsulate the complex and overlapping environment that we suddenly found ourselves in, particularly precipitated by the pandemic. And so out of that meeting, we really had this idea, like, how can we think about all these different things together at the same time in a way which makes sense? For me, also trained as a psychoanalyst, I was thinking a lot about a concept called mentalization, which is the capacity to really think through difficult, emotionally challenging, at times overwhelming ideas and experiences in a way that preserves the best possible function. And so ultimately, we came up with the model that we'll talk about later, not so much later. If you could advance the slide. Okay. So as April has, I think, as April has mentioned very fittingly, the model that we're familiar with seeing, which we'll look at it in a moment on the next slide, that Sam so often uses, was born out of work by Beverly Raphael, who's an Australian-based disaster mental health responder, with a linear model very similar to phases of grief, somewhat reminiscent of Kubler-Ross, 5 stages of grief. Warning, impact, honeymoon, disillusionment, enhanced community, and individual adaptation with some sense of equilibrium state, and reference to an additional disaster, second disaster. This was an excellent model in the 80s, and it still is. And that's why we continue to use it in essence. In the next slide, we can see the more familiar depiction of it, if you could advance. So this is the model that SAMHSA uses based on Beverly Raphael's model: pre-disaster, impact phase, heroic response, honeymoon, disillusionment, various trigger events, anniversary reactions, and a grief process that is part of reconstruction. And again, this remains a very useful model, but it leaves it to the end user to try to put it together in your own head or in your own communities if there's more than one thing happening at the same time. And at this point, I'm smiling, though it's not funny. I'd say we live in a state of continuous or constant disaster, overlapping on many different levels, and it makes it hard to conceptualize it. And so that brings us to the work of our committee. If you could advance the slide, which is an interdisciplinary group. So one sunny Sunday afternoon, I think not too long after that group for the advancement of psychiatry meeting, I was thinking, like, how could we possibly kind of make sense of it? And I borrowed this from Microsoft Word Smart Art, but it's a graphic that I had used in a series of relationship books that I co-authored that was intended to, in a relatively simple way, outline a developmental model where instead of having, we know developmentally things don't go in sequences, they overlap and recirculate. So this simple arrow model, I very quickly and loosely adapted the SAMHSA model into a kind of a developmental model. I left off all the feedback loops, right? There's always feedback loops and going forward and going backward, but to capture the essence of it with a pre-pandemic new wave anticipation, certainly with COVID in mind, as we are having rolling waves. You learn a little bit with each stage, and each time you kind of get pushed back, it's like being in the ocean. The impact stage, the heroism and adaptive responses that take place, and then reconstruction. And I just shared it with the group, and to my gratitude and delight, there was interest in carrying it forward. And after many, many, many different phases, we arrived at what we'll share and go through in more detail, the chronic cyclical disaster, what I like to refer to as a blueprint, to distinguish it from an infographic, because it's really a collection of multiple infographics that we'll review in detail. The purpose of this blueprint, I'm just clicking the box away. The purpose of the blueprint is to provide an overview. Any particular part of this blueprint could be expanded in great detail, like imagine zooming in on the detail. It could be adapted into digital document where you can click on different areas to get specific information or resources. And it's designed to appeal to principal stakeholder groups of directly affected populations, first responders, and communities. Though there's many more stakeholders, for example, policymakers, who can also use this. So we don't want people to feel overwhelmed. The idea isn't to look at this document and kind of get the whole thing in one bite. The idea is to really take time with it. So we'll start that process today. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about the first section, the phases of disaster. And let me just pull up my version of the document, which is a little bigger on my screen. So the phases of disaster section is contextualized in our understanding that this is a community context sensitive approach to promoting adaptive disaster response. That is the purpose of the whole document. Phases of disaster. Chronic cyclical disasters push a community through exhausting recurring phases of anticipation, impact, and adaptation before recovery and growth phase take place. And so those are the phases that we have landed on, and we continue to contemplate them, but feel reasonably comfortable. So the phase one that we're talking about here is the anticipation phase, characterized by threat and anticipatory anxiety, which varies with the nature of the disaster and contextual factors like other stressors and events happening. Sometimes there's no anticipatory phase with a sudden onset event that's understood. And we see that there are varying intervals between different waves. So anticipation can vary quite a bit depending, again, on the specific community and nature of the disaster. The next phase we spelled out is, again, the impact phase. And so this is where the strongest emotional response usually is for a lot of people. It's most memorable in a lot of ways. There's more activation of fight, flight, and survival circuits during this phase. And depending on how quickly it comes on and how well prepared the community is able to be, there may be more warning and preparation or less warning and preparation. The psychological impact of this phase is largely defined by the degree of exposure to distress and how much risk there is, uncertainty of survival. And a key characteristic of this phase is also being uncertain about how other important people are doing, which certainly adds to the stress. And again, remember, these phases are overlapping and kind of can cycle back to each other. And you can see that we've indicated this with this feedback loop in the next phase, adaptation, which feeds back into the anticipation phase. In your mind's eye, you can imagine that these feedback loops could be more, there could be more of them, but we didn't want to make it overly cluttered. So the adaptation phase can be quite prolonged in many cases, or it can be shorter depending on the nature of the event, resources, and community preparedness. It's characterized by feelings of relatively greater safety and stability, and less uncertainty about where people are and what has happened, and what the future will hold. There's an initial phase of altruism, and then potentially followed by disappointment, anger, and resentment. So it captures the heroism disillusionment dynamics that we're very familiar with. And again, depending on the duration, energy may be very high at the beginning, but then people start to lose steam and really also need to work in a group so that people can check in with each other, support each other, and take turns rather than getting too burned out. And the level of support for disasters, say from governmental or community groups, is also key in the adaptation phase. As the text here says, next, individuals and communities realize the limits of disaster assistance, and people may feel abandoned, or supported, depending on that response. But the relationship with authority and government is important. And then the growth and recovery phase, to an extent, we have to ask whether disasters are over, but for a given disaster, it may really come to a close. With the pandemic, we sort of ask ourselves, well, when do we say that it shifted from a pandemic into an endemic phase? And then the point, though, is that when there's a sense that the disaster has resolved to a certain extent, we enter this growth and recovery phase, which is marked by a restoration of previous or new routines, accompanied by feelings of things being back to normal for some or different for other people, quote unquote, new normal. And this varies a great deal depending on factors like post-traumatic growth and resilience. And for example, there are some studies of people during quarantine that some groups recover by returning to their baseline. Other groups will grow as a result of adversity and increase things like meaningfulness or purpose in life. But by no means is the intention here to prescribe any particular course of recovery or to suggest that growth should happen. In many cases, restoration is the best outcome. Okay. So I think that is good for me for now. I'm going to hand off the conversation, and we'll come back later for questions and further elaboration. Thank you.
So thanks, Grant. The thing I want to talk about is, if you look at how we blocked it out above, you essentially lose that visual of people's general sense of well-being or how well a community is doing psychologically in the aftermath of a disaster. So we had to incorporate a piece here that talks about stress regulation during overwhelming stress of a disaster. And one of the guiding principles we kept in developing this model was that, the goal of a model like this is helping people understand where they are and is what they're having expectable or normal, and what's coming next, and what they might, and giving them an ability to think about what they might do to either mitigate what's going on now or be ready for what's coming next. And so part of understanding where you are psychologically after a disaster, it requires consideration of what's expectable or normal and what goes beyond that. So with that in mind, we incorporated into this chronic disaster model a brief discussion of stress regulation. So the first concept is this continuum of response from eustasis, or maybe let's just call that feeling fine, to extremes of distress response. And so for the purposes of this model, we thought about both over and under regulated. But you start out in this zone of healthy stress regulation. And in there, psychological responses are mild, they're transient, they're easily reversed. They probably don't cause any significant impairment. And within this zone, you can largely think of people as self-regulating. But when you get more intense or more prolonged stresses, that can push people outside of that healthy stress regulation zone, where their psychological responses do actually generate noticeable distress or impairment, or they persist longer than would be expected. And those individuals are the ones we want to identify as ones who would do better with some sort of intervention to mitigate their response. So let's think about the range of reactions that could be described as over or under-regulated. In the under-regulated domain, it's pretty easy to visualize intense distress reactions like anger, irritability, sleep disruption, anxiety, or panic reactions. In the over-regulated domain, you might observe things like emotional detachment or withdrawal or numbing behaviors. Now, frequently layered on top of these distress reactions are health risk behaviors. And these are things like increased use of substances in an effort to cope, increased family conflict, or even family violence. Other things like being absent from the workplace, whether that workplace is a traditional workplace or being present for the work of recovery or recovery after a disaster. It can also be what we refer to as presenteeism, where, in other words, you're so lost within your own thoughts and feelings, you're there, but you're not really meaningfully contributing to the effort. It can also show up in risk behaviors around decision-making about evacuation or re-entry into affected areas. Now, one of the behaviors or the health risk behaviors that's not always recognized is what we call over-dedication or devotion to work or recovery tasks that is beyond the point of actually attending to their own necessary self-care, where you become ineffective or unable to contribute. So the bottom line on this section of the model is that we need to observe the stress responses and make an attempt to classify where they appear to be in the healthy zone of regulation, or if they've moved outside that zone. And that enables decision-making about what to do to help nudge people back into this zone of healthy regulation. And I will now pass on to, I think it's April's turn.
Yes, thank you, Kurt. I am always fascinated every time I see the model and in learning more and more. I'm so impressed with the colleagues here who have really put all of this together. Can we move the slide up? This is an intense infographic, as you can imagine. So we expect that, the other direction, please, Lindsay. We expect that it will take all of us, and hopefully that you will too, once its publication's out and everybody can see it more closely, to really have to study it and look at the information that might be most helpful as we use the model to work with communities as they work towards disaster recovery. So in the faces of disaster, I really appreciate this piece very much. We see the core groups that represent those impacted. And of course, we know from the research that everyone who's exposed to a disaster is impacted in some way that might not be changed by it, but certainly affected in some way or another. And we have looked at these three basic groups: survivors, community leaders, and responders, in terms of the different areas and the phases, from anticipation to impact, then to adapting to the disaster and the effects, as well as getting on some kind of a path towards traumatic growth and recovery. But we recognize that within each of these core groups is that there are many subgroups, those that we need to reach, and those who may have different responses to the impacts of the events. And so in survivors, we look at those who have individual high-risk issues or concerns. In the community leaders, there are many things to look at because it influences the response altogether. So leadership really has that power and influence in helping things to go well or not. And we look at, and I think we heard at the start of the day, our CDP representative was just so good at talking over and over. I hope that you heard her say that we work with the local community. This is majorly important. They know the community the best. They know who the leaders are who are influential in the community. They know how to access the resources in the community and what the community's perception of health, mental health, illness, and recovery really is. So we reach out, and when there is a significant kind of a way to look at how the community is going to move towards recovery based on how they work together with federal, state, and local colleagues, and including those who are designated by disaster response agencies like your local Red Cross, your faith-based folks, and other VOEDs that you're familiar with. Religious leaders have a high influence in many communities. Social network leaders. I mean, there's so many people from within the community that we must work with. They also help us to understand the cultural aspects or the many different cultures that may be within a particular affected community. and how to work through some of the difficult issues, whether they're turf issues, whether they are, staffing, or whether they are how to get people to work together and figure out how to fund the response and get what they need. And then, of course, we know that we're concerned about our responders. We're human beings who are not immune to the impacts of disasters. We need to be properly trained, have the confidence and the competence to be able to do all of the activities from the preparedness to the response and helping people move to the recovery. And of course, majorly being in charge of the safety of those who are within the community. And so as we move down the infographic a little bit more, I'm not going to read all of these out to you, but as I said, once we have this, and you can see it's marked up because it is a draft, it's getting ready for publication. So we're at that pre-publication level. So you'll see some of this confidential draft and notes of the folks that are noted who are involved in this in the background will be removed. So you can see more of what we're looking at in terms of, you can see color coded, we move to what do survivors need to do in anticipation, right? Because we know that preparedness activities can help people feel less distressed when something actually does happen. They need to do something with their nervous, anxious energy, especially in natural disasters when there's a lot of news about anticipating something happening. Then what do they need to do in the impact stage, and how can they come together, share their experiences, feel connected? And again, as we said, with the adaptation of survivors, being able to participate in the local community, whether they're planning memorials or coming together. We know that as survivors come together in groups, that's a sign of recovery. When they're more isolated and working in individual ways, they're generally struggling a little bit more. So we look at coming together in groups and doing things in community is a really good sign of moving to adaptation. And then how do people integrate the experience as they move on in their lives, whether they continue on the recovery path where they've got a lot more work to do or not. We just want to make sure they are on a path, and how are they integrating the lessons that they've learned from this event so that they come out not only with some of the negative effects that might happen to them, but how do we encourage kind of the buzzword resilience, but it really means moving forward, being able to go on with their lives and continue to experience joy even in the midst of disaster. Our community leaders, one of their primary roles is good public communications and risk communications. I think we've never seen this more evident than we have in the pandemic. And more recently in some of the, unfortunately, the mass violence incidents where our communications with the public can severely impact the levels of emotional distress and their perceptions of the event. Key role of community leaders. Then we move to the impact phase and the adaptation phase for leaders. Again, the same issues are here. How do we pull together restoring basic functions, the sense of safety in the community, trust in the community that they're able to move forward, that they can come together and repair and recover and move on to the completion of those growth and recovery tasks that they are aiming towards. And our responders have continuous activities, certainly in the anticipation phase. They're constantly planning and training and anticipating these events, and also learning from the after action reports so that lessons learned can be implemented in anticipating the next incident. They continuously also focus on working with the local community and training their healthcare workers, the schools, the faith-based communities, places where groups are, where people who might be together in a disaster know how to respond and how to work well and trust and take information from the responders so that they follow direction and that their safety is definitely attended to. As you can see, we've got lots to learn in these areas. So we're continuously learning and working with our responder communities. Our responders also help people to adapt. They are working much more closely with our behavioral disaster mental health experts. Thank goodness we've seen that actually in the past, probably 2 decades, where the disaster behavioral health responders, like many of our CECT volunteers, are well integrated into all phases of the disaster, and especially so in the adaptation stage. In the early days, as you heard again in the beginning of the conference, applying psychological first aid, crisis counseling, stabilization, grounding, social supports, good coping skills, and having that compassionate presence that the American Red Cross calls what our early disaster behavioral health work is, in addition to assessing and referral those who are in the high-risk populations and having more severe responses. And then again, a key point for our responders is to put out those after-action reports, those lessons learned, so that as we go forward, we can continue to change and improve how we ready and respond to disasters. And our responder community is always monitoring how people are going forward. Our disaster behavioral health responders continue to follow on, reach out, do outreach to the communities, so that those people who may have had a more serious negative mental health effect can be identified and referred for further treatment. Should they develop, like the small percentage, 5 to 10% who do develop a mental illness, may be able to go ahead and get formal treatment. And to note, though, in the mass violence events, we do see that the recovery trajectory is slower, and that the numbers of people who are at higher risk of developing a mental illness about double. So we have a lot of monitoring and surveillance to do as we continue through the growth and recovery phase. There's lots to talk about here in terms of special populations, those at high risk, underserved communities, not only in their preparation phase, but also in the response. We have some research that tells us that underserved communities are also underserved in terms of disaster resources. And so there's much for us to be aware of. So looking at these groups kind of gives you a picture of where the focus is, but within that, there are many subgroups. So lots of work for us to do, but I think it's a good picture of how we're affected in the community, and hopefully it will help in using the model as we go forward with this chronicity and this continuous disaster activity that we've been hit with over certainly the last 3 years, but it's probably been about a decade now. So I know it's a lot to take in, and we're talking fast, but want to give you a good picture of this. So I'm going to turn it then over to Sander, I think is our next speaker, to the next segment then, Lindsay.
Thank you. And I'm going to try something here. I'm going to request a remote control. So what I was trying to do while I'm trying to reconnect my touchpad here, what I'm trying to do, no, I'm having a very odd technical difficulty here. So no, I'm absolutely unable to do it. So let's just forget that. So what I'm going to ask is to, for a moment, let's zoom out and just take a bird's eye view of the entire graphic, and just go ahead. Wonderful. So before I delve further into the last two sections of it, just wanted to give you a sense of, we're trying to really demonstrate the flow. And the reason we are so focused on demonstrating the flow is because we want to get ahead of it. And so much of the conversation and so much thinking that has gone into this tool, into this blueprint, is just that we are trying to get ahead of it with the planning. Similar to what we heard from other presenters when we heard from the disaster philanthropies work, when we heard about our colleagues in Colorado, thinking about how do we understand where the community as a whole may be before the disaster strikes. And when we have that clarity, when we have that understanding, is when we can adequately plan. So we can go ahead and zoom in to the last two sections. So as we zoom in and we take a look at the community stress load threshold and community balance sheet portions of the total blueprint, the things that I would love to point out is that there is really nothing new here. It is just structuring what so many of the presenters spoke about while we heard the rest of the conference. And when we hear in preparation and conversation, I was struck how Amy wistfully was talking about yesterday. Wouldn't it be amazing to have a way to conceptualize and have a tool that allows us to really take into consideration pre-existing stressors and pre-existing strengths of a particular community and help conceptualize it in a way that allows us to prepare better. Our aspiration here is to give you just such a tool. So when we look at the mitigating the cumulative stress on the community, when we think in terms of where are the portions of the community that are functioning in a way that allows them to take stock of the factors that may be impairing, let it be a new refugee community with specific language needs, or a community that has highly represented population of folks that are older or those who are younger. If it is a college, slanted college campus community, or if you have a retirement community, or any of the mix of the above. What are the things that would be things to consider? What are the foundational issues when we think about, let's stick with that university community, with a single employer being highly overrepresented, where the community is transient by the very nature of it. What are the things that need to be thought about? Who serves that community? When we think about a chronic stressor on the surrounding community, and even as we understand what we do as disaster responders when we come in after the disaster strikes. Is there an infrastructure to receive us as the outsiders before we can function in a way that addresses the needs of the community that we're there to support? We never want to become a wave of the secondary disaster that strains already strained. So the more we can understand of where the particular community, particular municipality or state are, the better off we're going to be understanding and helping to frame what will happen after the disaster. If we think about what ends up happening post-disaster, where both the healthcare community and the community at large are disrupted. When that happens, you may not have the same traditional utilization of resources. So what happens 2-3 years down the line? Well, we tend to underfund if we simply look at that financial experience of what has happened. So we want to be aware of some of these time shifts. So if we scroll down to the community balance sheet, we try to capture that. Take a look. We have disaster number one, which is something that we have a somewhat anticipated disaster. We understand that there is a hurricane season coming. We have a wave of anticipation, then there is the impact, but at the same time, the same community may be impacted by something quite unexpected, a man-made disaster, a terrorist attack, domestic terrorist attack, or something that truly hits at the core of the community in a huge way. So now you have two areas of impact, one anticipated, one unanticipated. There is going to be competition for resources. There is also going to be an opportunity to see and have hope, because recovery from one event can help to anticipate recovery from the other. While we enter that recovery space, even as we're still adapting to the disaster number one, we still are acutely aware of a strong opportunity of something else happening. It may be smaller in scale, it may be smaller in its volume of individuals affected. Nonetheless, because it is on top of the community that may be stressed already and resources are already taken up by the other two events, this smaller quote unquote disaster can feel enormous. So we want to have a sense of what that could be like, and we want to be able to anticipate and prepare even as we enter the recovery space of what are our resources that we have just utilized for the immediate response of the impact and adaptation. How are we supporting the individuals? How we're supporting the responders? What are the wellness activities? And how do we tie it all together into a cohesive, long-term, slow burn response that allows us to have an effective way of anticipation that incorporates and integrates these multiple hits that we may suffer from various disasters. So that's the hope. And that's where we really want to get ourselves in the framework. So this graphic, this whole blueprint is really designed to be a common language that both the administrators responsible for a particular area should have, as well as the community leaders, natural community leaders, but also members of the community, where we can play off of the same sheet of music, so we can have that shared language, so we can talk about how our community can move to recovery together despite these multiple stressors. I think we can pause and take some questions.
I think let's go back to our agenda first. Hold on. Yes, so I'm just going to wrap up, and then Lindsay will open up the floor for questions. So thanks, Sander, Kurt, April, for reviewing respective areas of the blueprint. We're really looking forward to getting people's questions and feedback, because we are in the final design stages. And you can see that, as I said at the beginning, any one of these areas could be considerably expanded. And on that note, we are working on an accompanying paper which will describe and expand this. And we envision that once we get this final model down, there's a lot of different directions we can take it, and would love to brainstorm a bit about that with participants. Thanks very much for your time and attention.
Okay, hi, thank you to our presenters for giving that wonderful presentation. As many have noted in the comment sections, this is looking to be a highly anticipated and much needed view of these cyclical disasters in which we find ourselves in present day. As Grant said at the beginning, you know, the older models that we originally worked with were in this assumption that we would only have one disaster happening at a time in a community, right? So the need for this has just grown. I'm just looking through the chat real quick.
It looks like there's a couple of comments. I just want to make a response to Amy. Thank you in this comment that you make about speaking to exhaustion of multiple impacted communities, which is intensely important. Also, we don't get into the details of the disaster distress responses, but in this case too, we have got to talk about grief. It's just this overlaying impact that we're all experiencing, whether we've had a particular loss related to COVID or other events or not, but certainly in this stage that we're in. But in addition to all of the what we know from the psychoeducation and psychological first aid about the various 5 domains and the different responses, in this case, we need to make sure that we're looking at these long-term effects of this continued exhaustion of both the multiple impacts and the grief with the tremendous losses and the way that these losses have happened without the ability to have ritual and memorial and those things that actually can be protective factors, as you're asking, Maggie, is to be able to come together as community and recognize these things. So I just wanted to make a comment about that. Thanks, Lindsay.
Yeah, definitely. It's really important. Oh, Grant, thank you for that that research on
I'm always
grief during
happy.
COVID.
I'm always happy to shamelessly plug my own work, but I'm reviewing other people's work, which is really what's important here. It's easy enough to write it up.
Yes, and if anybody wants to see some of that research that Grant posts about and talks about, our volunteers have access to our CCT digital library, where we have so many resources on this subject and on more. So I think one question that is, I think, going to be really important about this going forward is in terms of the faces of disasters that we have noted here: survivors, community leaders, and responders. What is one or two things that you hope each of those groups can take away from this infographic, just to kind of like narrow down the focus and just think about like what, when you were designing this, what is just a couple things that you hope survivors can take away, or community leaders or responders can take away and utilize in their daily experience of disaster?
Well, I'd like to start, because I think my answer to that's very simple, and it's something that I've said repeatedly when working on this project is, the whole role of a tool like this is to enable both responders, but also people who are in a disaster to take a look at, where am I? Is what I'm experiencing sort of within the realm of what's expectable or what's okay? What's coming? And in both of those instances, is there something that I can do? Another way, is there something that I can engage some efficacy to better my situation?
Yeah, that's definitely important. I mean, I think one of the big things that has come up in creating this model, of course, was the idea of people being able to kind of take back control of their lives and their experiences with the disasters, right? Of being able to just protect themselves and ready themselves and know like what they're experiencing isn't wrong or quote unquote crazy, right? It's very normal in the face of all of these multiple disasters that we experience. So thank you.
To build on what Kurt said too, is that there are a couple of things that I think come out of this. And one is that when we share with communities, when we enter communities and start talking about education, about what to expect, they often respond that they find the initial model really helpful, so that they get a sense of what to anticipate. But really importantly, as we all know in the disaster world, is that it helps them not to pathologize themselves, right? And especially when you see in this chronic model is of course we're not feeling ourselves. Of course we're more tired. Of course we have some depressive-like symptoms. This is exhausting. This is really difficult. We wouldn't be human if we weren't feeling some anxiety, some depression-like symptoms, and again normalizing or making it more common. Of course, this whole situation is not normal, but helping people to recognize that these emotional distress responses are not major mental illness for most people. They are, common expected disaster responses, and because they can literally see in front of them what's been happening to our communities, what's been happening to us as individuals, as responders, as healthcare workers, as those who are trying to help, as those who are in the nonprofit world, who are continuing to serve our community. So I think it really can help to counter this message that we're seeing in the social media that all our healthcare workers have PTSD. Nothing makes me more upset. I don't know about you, but nothing makes me more upset than pathologizing some of the grittiest people in the world. Let's say, first of all, our doctors, our nurses, our healthcare workers who have dealt with all kinds of epidemics before and other pandemics. They dealt, with AIDS, they dealt with Ebola, they dealt with people come in with mass shootings, with gang violence, with all kinds of injuries, with horrific car accidents. This is not a group that turns to PTSD because they're overworked and because this is difficult. They're having common expected reactions to very horrific environment. And so I think this model clearly states that when you look at it and you see, oh my goodness, of course I'm exhausted, or of course I'm distressed. And I think that's a really helpful piece as we try to educate communities more and more about what to expect after natural disasters, community and mass violence incidents, as well as this pandemic. It gives them more of a sense of control and less like there's something wrong with them, right? Because we know from the research, if people think they're doing poorly, they're going to do more poorly. And so we want to make sure we're helping to understand and not pathologize their reactions.
If I can, I'm going to ping off of that, and I'm also going to try to respond to Christy and Annika's questions about the systematic and generational experiences. And I know when I start to say this, Sandra's going to jump in and take it and run with it. So, I mean, this was the whole concept of creating this overlapping disasters, this idea of the systematic factors that are contributing, the underlying factors that, just the earlier model, just it doesn't address that. It doesn't capture that. And so that's something that we've tried to do with this is to recognize and reflect in our expectations of disaster response so many of those underlying inequities and problems that already exist before a wildfire ever comes through town. And I'll let Sandra expand on that.
It's funny, even talking about it, it kind of makes me think of the old joke about the two professors who are complaining to each other how the class they're teaching it's just so challenging. I explained it to them 3 times. I finally got it. They still haven't. So I feel like I'm in this position where talking about it and explaining it, I'm learning and getting some clarity on this as well. And what I'm realizing is that the traditional model, in a way, talks about the community in isolation. In a way, talks about the community without the external factors, without the external resources. And in a way, I think this is what caused us to start going down this path, because the reality is communities aren't in isolation. And we are there as healthcare providers, as the disaster providers, as communities at large, where we strive to assist, we strive to help. And the better we understand where the community is at, the more cultural humility, the more understanding of the risk factors and strengths, the more effective and appropriate the response. And this is where I think the strength of this model is.
Yes, that is definitely true. And we've had a lot of conversation about that in the last year, right? About doing. I think it's particularly important given what has happened in the last few weeks, right? The shooting in Buffalo and the attack on trans people that is happening in many states across the US right now, to remember the importance of addressing those. So we have another question here from Mehi Jerry, who is, so she says, I find that language in disaster mental health often attempts to reduce pathologizing in a way that can create a binary between people with quote unquote mental illnesses and the broader population who have quote unquote normal experiences. And she says that question is to simply recognize that we need a nuanced and greater level of resources for people who do not meet high levels of acuity for mental health needs. Can the model speak to that?
It's a complex question, and I think it's a complex issue. And along the lines of Grant promoting his work, I'm going to go ahead and promote mine. We talk about the language a lot. We talk about understanding of the community a lot. And even framing the opportunity for the community to speak up effectively. I've been working with a team at Languages of Care, and I'm going to put the link, where we're embarking on understanding and grasping that clinical and cultural nuance to understand how do we communicate effectively. And so much of it goes beyond the mechanics of literal translation. Capturing that level of understanding of how do we have the opportunity to capture the disruption created by disasters and have improved chances of advocacy. How do we coach the language in a way that allows the community to be heard effectively? So this is finding these opportunities and finding that common language and being able to plug it in so you can turn around to decision makers in the community and say, this is where we are and this is why we're doing what we're doing is the aspiration.
So I think it's almost time to wrap up along the lines of what you're saying about language. And it goes back to the purpose of the model is creating conceptual framework where we don't fall into false dichotomies, where we can see things on a continuum. We can look at the biology of stress response and adaptation and make room for all different stakeholders to be met where they are.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. This has been a great panel. I'm glad that our audience members who are here, really, you all seem to be loving this model. So that's great to hear, right? That this is ringing true for a lot of people.